Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, welcome to the Good Life Podcast. I'm Matt Carpenter, and I'm thankful today to have as our guest Mr. John Waters. John is a writer. He has written for various newspapers in Ireland. He lives in Ireland, and the way that I was first introduced to him is through his book, which I have here. He's written several, but Give Us Back the Bad Roads. So, John, thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure, Matt. Nice to talk to you.
So, in your book, for us, especially here in the States, that title strikes us as odd. Someone would actually ask for bad roads. And of course, we'll get into the details of this, but just to start with, why would you want to actually have a return to the bad roads in Ireland?
It's a reference really to the span of my life and the changing face of the landscape of Ireland at that time, in part. There are many facets of the title, meanings to the title, but in this narrower context, there's this kind of idea that when we had a simple country, when we had a country that had basic facilities, basic services, basic provisions for our needs as human beings, that we had autonomy, we had freedom, we had self-sufficiency, and that we lost this. We gave this up in a kind of a Faustian pact to become modern. And that the most visible sign of that modernity, so-called, in quotation marks, is the motorways which now crisscross our country and which really changed the nature of travel. I mean, as Milan Kundera said one time in one of his books, he said there's a difference between roads and routes, that a route takes you between two places. A road is a journey, is a place in itself that moves through space. And you are in the place where you are at every second, at every moment. Whereas on a route, you are not. You are on your way from A to B or A to Z. And so that's so it's a kind of a plea to go back, not go back to the past, but to go back to a moment when we were free, when we had our country. It was our country, and we could choose what to do with it, as opposed to having it occupied by vague, ominous forces, which is the current situation, I'm afraid. And that book was written in 2018, and it preceded the present phase, which began 40 months ago, 40 months ago, with the announcement of the pandemic. And of course, everything that I talk about in the book has been accelerated and amplified thousands of times in that period. So now the book, really in a quite shocking way for me, never mind for anybody who might read it, is prophetic of where we are and what this is all. So I didn't even know, Matt, that it was in a certain sense, when I wrote it, about something. That it was about some change in the world, other than reacting to certain events, describing certain events. And then suddenly, it's, a couple of years later, it starts to kind of erupt in front of me that this is actually all connected, and that it has been connected for a very long time, and that the roots of it go way, way back, not just in Ireland, in Irish history, but in the history of the world. And that this is something quite shocking and quite ominous, obviously very ominous, and something, which I think is very difficult to explain, even to oneself. One can feel it. One feels the horror of it, but finding the words is very difficult. And really, I think we cannot, I think, function with mere sociological descriptions or political descriptions or economic descriptions or any of those kind of normal codes that are used to describe societies. We have to really think at least feel in the realm of the esoteric, in the realm of the supernatural. And that's, I think, again, the title is about all that. It's about really also, the fact that my father was a mill car driver, which is really, I suppose, the Irish equivalent of a stagecoach, without the horses. And um, he drove right around the country, like in a very rickety old jalopy of a van over for many years. And I went with him, and to see the countryside in that state, like, was such a beautiful thing. And it is so strange and so sad now to see that it is no longer respected for that existence, for that, that
Mm.
essence that I experienced as a child.
One of the things that I appreciate about the book, in addition to the fact that you just so when I picked it up the first time, I picked it up along with another book also about Ireland. So I was going to immerse myself fully, and I was struck. Within just a few chapters, I read the first few chapters of your book and the first few chapters of the other book. I ended up putting the other book down because I said I can't. I'm enjoying John Waters' writing so much more than I am the writing of this historian over here, and so it was a delight. You have a wonderful writing style. It is engaging. It shows you are a craftsman in the art of journalism, and that is evident in your work. But
What?
it, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I do think that, this is something I feel very strongly about, Matt, that writing, you see, we live in the era of the internet, in which words and sentences have come to take on a different form. That people no longer understand. I find actually a lot of even people who read what I write, they're irritated by the length of the articles or the length of the sentences. And I say, but hang on, what, this is not a memorandum. We are not working for a corporation. I am
Right.
not on the 14th floor and you are not on the 7th. We're not sending each other bullet points, of information about the world or about our corporation. We are speaking in multiple layers about the meaning of existence, and that's what I try to do in my writing. That it's not just information. It's also feeling. It's also, memory and irony and all of kind of paradox. All of these things are layered, I would hope. At least this is what I aspire to. And of course, any writer worth his salt or her salt, that's what they try to do, is to convey in almost like a musical way, as much as rhythmically, and in terms of euphony and harmony and all of these kind of devices, to create something that is a thing in itself, that the
Yes.
writing becomes not just a description, but a sort of a representation of what you are talking about.
Yes.
So that's kind of what I think. I think I really do think that's something that we have is very little remarked upon in that radical change that has happened, where everybody just kind of, the way that people just knock things off on a screen, and they don't even bother with the punctuation, and never mind trying to get the syntax right, or try to get the rhythm of a sentence right. Who would do that writing an email? Because so much writing is like that now, we're losing that quality of writing, which is really the important part of it.
Well, in your book, you alternate between more, somewhat your history and your background as a writer for the Irish Times. That's correct.
That's right, yeah.
Where you wrote for 24 years, but also uh, there are elements where you go into a more nostalgic, in the best sense of the term, philosophical perspective, but all of it is an ode to your dad
Mm.
and your admiration for your father is evident. So talk to us a little bit. You were born in 1955. You mentioned your dad already, and 1955 life was very different in Ireland. So what was the Waters house like growing up in Ireland in the late 50s and in the 60s? Because your dad was also a little bit older than many fathers are
Yes.
when their sons are young. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I accidentally discovered, Matt, that I have 99% certainty of this, not 100% because I haven't had a first source uh, confirmation, but I have a reasonable certainty now that I was conceived on my father's 50th birthday. When I do all the math on this, I think it's
Hmm.
almost certain. And I don't know what that makes me. I often ask, was I some kind of consolation or some kind of, celebration? I'm not sure.
Yes, yes.
But so my father was older, so in a certain sense, he might have been like a modern grandfather in a way. That's kind of the way things are now. The grandfather would be that much older, and but he was quite an extraordinary man. He was the kind of man who he had no education in the formal sense. I mean, he left school at 11 or something like that, and but was self-educated, and he was very adept at all kinds of physical things like carpentry or mechanics or things like that. He was constantly reading books about mechanics and engineering and those kinds of things. So, and he was a very, very great grasp of mathematics, as I found when I was in trouble doing algebra or whatever. He would be way ahead of me in no time. He would figure it out much quicker than I
Mm.
would, even though I was familiar with it in a certain different way. Uh, but also, he was quite. I suppose you would use the word eccentric. I would never use this word of him, but about him. But he was different, very different. He was a very serious man, but also very funny in his own way, and very much loved by people. I mean, he was this kind, as I say, the stagecoach driver, the mail car driver. But so he was carrying mails, letters, post, and also newspapers, and also passengers. Even though there were very few, there were no seats usually in the van. People would sit on the mailbags, and
Mm.
sometimes he would have 20 people in the back of the van, of course, quite irregular, all talking away, driving on the road
Wow.
between my hometown, Castlerea, and Ballahadreen or Elfen or one of those towns. And he drove very slowly because he was always very busy talking to everybody and turning around. And so it was that kind of situation. The van was held together by ropes and wires and all kinds of things, and he spent the Sundays, he worked 6 days a week, but he spent the Sundays repairing it. And of course, as a childhood, I spent a long time lying on the ground alongside him, handing him in wrenches and so on. But he was also a very political man, very passionately interested in Ireland and its history, and it's all of the thing, the civil from the Civil War. He belonged to one side, although he wasn't a member of a political party. Everybody belonged to one side or the other.
Right.
The divide was between, the treaty. It had to do with the treaty, which resolved the situation of Ireland, but divided the country with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And he belonged to the side that accepted the treaty, accepted the division on the basis that it was interim, and he always held that if the Civil War had not happened, we would have united the country within a few years. I don't know if
Mm.
that's true, but he was that kind of man. But he was also very. I say, in the book about him, that we lived in conditions that were really almost like nomadic, even though we lived in a house. It was very impermanent. Like, we didn't have electricity or running water like when I was a child, even though that wasn't the case for everybody around us. It was just the house we were in, and so on. And he didn't mind that. Now, of course, my mother minded it somewhat, and we didn't enjoy it either. But he had that attitude that it was, in a certain sense, Matt, it strikes me as almost a pure representation of the religious impulse, which is to move through reality. You're moving forever towards the horizon, and you are not resting. You are not, because that ultimately your purpose is not here. And I
Mm.
think that in a certain sense, his life represented that. And of course, we were more earthbound, I suppose, and we
Right.
resented that a little bit. But as I grew older, I began to look at him much more closely. Of course, as a child, as a teenager, I fought with him relentlessly all the time, and we fell in and out and so on. But then as he grew older, I began to really look at him very closely and realize that this guy was some kind of seer. He really understood things at a level that you don't encounter now. I mean, I remember the 1st of January 1973, driving around with them. This was the day that Ireland went into the European Union, or what was then called the Common Market. Of course, it was they were using the salami tactic to draw us in, draw us in,
Right.
draw us in. But and he was absolutely opposed to this. And he described in really graphic terms to people that day. I remember that this was the greatest disaster that ever had befallen Ireland in all of its history.
Hmm.
Of course, now we know, I know for sure he was right. I thought he was, but that's a bit much, it's over the top. But no, I mean, what is happening in Ireland now is really the culmination of that prophecy. And he was so right. It is destroyed. Ireland is destroyed now as a consequence of having given up its sovereignty in that way, and its independence and its self-sufficiency and its opportunity to be a country of itself. You know that
Right.
it never even tried. We never even tried to be a proper country, to be a nation in the world. That is the great tragedy of Ireland, I believe. It's not that we failed. We didn't fail because if you go back over the history, we got our independence in 100 years ago now, 1921, and you know you could say that our timing was bad. Like if you look back, it happened between two world wars. Like everybody
Right.
was busy with other stuff, right? So there was no such thing as being helped up, getting a leg up. And so for 30, 40 years, we just floundered. And that was taken as almost a definitive statement of our absolute capacity to exist in the world, very misguidedly. And as a result, if you look at what happened then, we basically handed over our destiny to different entities. The European Union would be one, the American corporate sector would be another. You know, or we had this policy of foreign direct investment, which is that we would just basically sit here and let the American corporations come here, generate whatever little trickle of revenues that we could pick up in our caps, and that would do. It was like I often say is that it was like we had inherited a shop from our grandfather with an apartment over upstairs, and we just said, well, what are we going to sell in the shop? So we would sit in the cafe across the road every day, looking across at the building and thinking, what could we sell in the shop? And then we had the brilliant idea, oh, why don't we just rent out this shop and live upstairs? And that's what we did. That's what we've
Hmm.
done. And that's the key to our undoing. Now, everybody else did that as well, of course, but I never take that as a reason why we should do it. In fact,
Sure.
that's a reason for not doing it. If everybody else is doing it, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it.
Well, there was so much that Ireland had largely escaped throughout history, including even the Roman Imperium. Rome was limited as far as how far they could go. So the people of the clans of Ireland at that time had more freedom than someone say in Gaul or those areas. But now it's
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, to some extent that is true. Of course, we did miss out on certain things in a good way, but nevertheless, our history was. I mean, we were occupied, particularly in the last, in the penal times.
Right, right,
Uh, Ireland was, in a certain sense, free. I mean, we had many invasions, and these invasions were kind of incorporated. Uh, the Norse, the Normans, the Vikings, and so on. But the period of the penal laws, when really Ireland became really a slave nation,
right, right,
and which culminated in what are called the famines of the 1840s, which is a word that it can be misleading, let us say,
right.
because really these were genocides. This was a genocide of the Irish people. I mean, we lost 2 million people died and 2 million people left Ireland in that period. Our population went from 8 million to 4 million in a matter of 5 years or so. And really, so we were abominably treated. And I think that, you know, it's a shocking thing to see now what is happening in our country, because that experience where we were driven out of our country is being used. Our ancestors, or our neighbors, were sent out of the country, had to go, and many of them died on the way. many horrific stories, and I've done documentaries about this and so on, and articles and so on. But we we are now being told by our leaders that we went all over the world, therefore we have to open our door and let the world in now into Ireland, even though Ireland is a tiny country and is its resource is only for the first time, if that, getting its feet. Now, it's not getting its feet in a good way because, the Irish economy now, I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. They tell us Ireland is now the wealthiest country in the world. Yes, on paper, but that paper reflects not the well-being of Ireland. It reflects the well-being of the corporate sector. Um, and when you then look at the consequences of that for Ireland, I mean, we invited in the pharmaceutical industry back in the 1970s. And really, then it was part of the deal. They were on the way, they were fleeing America because they were trying to escape from anti pollution laws. And we basically said to them, look, this place is untouched. You can do what you like. Nobody's going to bother you for years and years. And now these people are preaching to us ecology and ESG and things and saying it's our fault that the world is allegedly suffering a climate crisis. So you know all of this. All of these things are universal now in the West, particularly because the West is clearly at war with itself, or rather, its leadership is at war with its people. That is what's happening, and these conditions are, if anything, more acute in Ireland than almost anywhere else. I don't say necessarily everywhere else because there are some really bad flashpoints, in Canada and in Australia and places like that. But in Ireland, we have one of the most vicious governments in the world, the nastiest people, and these are our own people. And again, it goes back to that thing that it's impossible to describe it. I've spent 40 months now trying to coin sentences to describe what is happening and my feeling about it and how it relates to what we might describe as a truth, if we can any longer articulate that. And I fail most of the time, I admit. I think, I try different things from different directions. Sometimes what you might call a spiritual perspective, sometimes a philosophical perspective, sometimes even a postmodern perspective. To try and find a way that people will begin to obtain a resonance that is that harmonizes with their experience. That's the most important thing for me as a writer, is that people say, oh, I can feel now that there is a correspondence between these words and how I feel about the reality.
Mm,
And that's been the hardest thing, because we look at these people were our neighbors. We elected them to lead us, to lead our government, to do our work for us, to look after our interests. And they have turned on us like dogs. Really, it's quite shocking. And of course, it's happening to other people. We see it in America and the United States as well. We
right.
see it in the United Kingdom. We see it in France. Uh, of course, and then, God help us, we see Ukraine. It's all seeming to stem from the same
Right.
and really, I'm not sure any longer. It seems to me that we live in a time when it's really a post-God world, isn't it? Really, in the sense that culturally, we no longer have the capacity to believe in the idea of creation or in the idea of a supreme being, and
Right.
therefore there is a sense like that there are no consequences to anything, that anything is possible and everything is permissible, and that the only fault that you can have is by being weak, by refusing orders, by because everything, it seems, is top down. Everything is the uh, the hidden puppet masters dictating what should happen in countries they have never set foot upon. These things really, they keep me awake at night, Matt. So let's maybe talk a little bit more about them.
So, well, one of the ironic elements to this, to what you're saying, is that in the past, Ireland was known as the Isle of Saints and Scholars.
Yeah.
There were many blessings. Of course, Thomas Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, wonderful book. That was not the book that I put down, by the way, when I was reading your book.
You
I
don't have
didn't.
to tell us what that book was, Matt. I'm sorry. We're not going to let you leave until you tell us.
But so, what are some of the blessings, though, that Ireland, in the past at least, when she was a stronger place? I know she was not dominant in the world in the way that, say, Britain was dominant, or France, or now, America. And I'm not even saying that being dominant is a good thing, but I know there are blessings, though, that the Irish gave. What are some of those good things in the past that she has bequeathed to the West?
I think that the most beautiful thing about Ireland, apart from the scenery, which is a different category. I mean, it's an extraordinarily beautiful country, but that beauty is equaled, I think, by the beauty of the personality of Ireland that you encounter and in the person, or you used to encounter. It's dying now. You see, this is because all these processes are crushing it. So that to me is the abiding memory I have of growing up, the gentleness of people. I don't say it was universal. Terrible things happened, and there
Sure,
was a war in the north of our country and so on. But my direct experience as a child growing up was that it was a safe place, that there was always and that there was a strong sense of justice always in Ireland, and that there was always a place or a person you could go to, and if you were in trouble, and if somebody was putting it upon you or something, and that you would get help, and you would be believed, or you would be listened to, and so there's that. And I think that the culture of Ireland was so rich. The music of Ireland went around the world, and still is very much honored in America, in Europe, in Germany, and Sweden, places, all kinds of places. And much more so actually than it is at home, because we have undergone these kind of this series of cultural ambushes through the last few decades, in which we have our nationhood has been attacked all the time. Our sense of proprietorship of our nation, of our country, is being attacked. We're now being told, no, you just arrived here the day before yesterday. You have no claim on this land, even though we've been here for hundreds, if not thousands, of years, and and so on. So, and also the literary tradition, which I think was particularly important because it was almost the Irish Revolution, the rising of 1916. That was the revolutionary moment, and that was coincided with the publication of Ulysses and that period, and subsequently writers like Beckett, and who were, people often think of Beckett as a kind of an absurdist writer, or a nihilistic writer, but he wasn't at all that. He was. If you actually look at Beckett's plays, and as an Irish person, the characters in them are actually real people. I mean, I used to meet these guys
mm-hmm.
on the road and in my street when I was a child. So there's a great deal of realism about them, but there's also, I think, a sort of spiritual yearning, which is hard to kind of to explain to people because they're so certain of Beckett as being, some kind of atheistic nihilist. But he wasn't really. I see him more as somebody who was challenging reality to reveal its positive dimensions, its hope, its promise for the future. And in that sense, he was, quite invigorating writer. I found him extraordinarily funny, because out of that impulse came the humor of much of his writing.
Right.
Almost a sense of all the time that hope being betrayed or lost or defeated. But yet he got up again and went on. I mean, that famous line, "I can't go on. I must go on. I'll go on."
Mm.
And that's almost like those three lines are that's Ireland's history.
Yes.
I can't go on. I must go on. I'll go on. And those words they resonate now too. I think this is something that sounds implausible because we live in a supposedly modern constitutional republic, democracy, etc., etc. Um, but this is we are now in the greatest trouble I think we've ever been in as a nation. Where this is terminal. This will be terminal unless we can find a way to reverse it, to prevent it. And because it's a universal attack, we therefore need to make connections with people in the wider world. Because we no longer, our people are defeated themselves and existentially by the processes that I've been talking about, which have been bombarding them for decades, really, now we see, but especially in the last decade, the last 12 or so years. I believe that there was really what the Spanish call an auto golpe, a self coup here in Ireland in 2011, where in effect uh, external forces moved in here and took control of not just our economy and our future in that sense, but also the culture. So all things that started, strange things started to erupt in Ireland. You know, like there are things that happen. Our Ireland, one thing you could always rely on Irish government, Irish politicians for was their incompetence. And now that there's no sign of that incompetence now, really, in this because what you can see a hidden hand at work in everything that happens. Everything is orchestrated, everything is rehearsed, everything is scripted, everything happens according to a protocol. And we have all these kind of psychological operations that happen all the time. Whenever something happens that might be conceivably inconvenient to the regime, within hours, it is as if some hidden force has moved in to deal with the situation and deal with it in the most cunning way and the most manipulative way, so as to deflect the energies of the people away from criticism of the government onto some kind of conflict. For example, there was a young woman murdered in Ireland at the beginning of 2022, and the suspect was a migrant. We didn't know this at the time, but immediately, uh, almost overnight, well, literally overnight, tens of thousands of young women were marshaled onto the streets with candles and pictures, framed pictures of this young woman, attacking Irish men for their misogyny and calling on Irish men to square up to their responsibility and to stop, mistreating women. It was known all the time that the person who had done this was a migrant, but they didn't want the focus of the reaction to be that. And so they created this psychological operation. And that's happened countless times in the last few years in Ireland. So you're dealing with an occupation. I could say who I believe it is. I'm sorry to say I believe that it is has a very significant American element.
Sure. Well,
The Democratic Party.
I'm
Uh,
sure
I
you're
think
right.
undoubtedly, because one of the people who came here in 2011 was Obama, and that was a very interesting moment, where he spoke in College Green in Dublin, and the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister at the time, welcomed him and more or less insinuated that this was the future of Ireland, whatever he meant by that, that this would be the future of Ireland, and uh, and so it has proved. And so now Ireland doesn't belong to the Irish; it belongs to the world. It belongs to the globe. It is a globalized country. It is what the great Irish patriot Thomas Davis talked about when he said that. He said, "This Ireland of ours is no sandbank." And by that he meant it's not just a piece of territory that we walk across. It's a
Mm.
beloved ancient place, and so on. Well, now it is a sandbank.
I'm reminded in what you are, the things you're saying, of C.S. Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength.
Yeah,
There is so much here, including the manufactured riots, that he was talking about this in 1945, 43, whenever that book was published. And I mean, and it has manifested itself. But one of the positive things that I remember when the beings, the Eldils, the angelic forces that then the good ones come to Earth, they say that those who are evil, opened up the door. In other words, they started this, so they're going to receive. I mean, they open the door, so now we get to come and help take care of the job.
Hmm.
One thing that I've thought before, as nations nations have fallen to international bureaucracy, to this perspective, this overarching liberalization and secularism, that also, though, as you hinted at earlier, it opens the door for those who are faithful, for the people of God, to also lock arms internationally as well.
Yes,
You know,
I agree.
so it's similar to the way that those as the Church of England sent many over to Africa, now there are some of the most faithful Anglican missionaries, some of the most faithful Anglicans in Africa are now sending missionaries to Britain to
Yes,
re-evangelize.
yes.
So they're helping the mother remember what she's given up. It's kind of like how, if the prophet Hosea, when he married a woman who was a harlot, and then she left, it would be like her children coming back and saying, "No, mom, this is the right way."
Well, I see the same thing happening in relation to Ireland and so on as well. But I cannot say how that will work, if it will work,
Sure,
because I think the nature of this war that we're in, it being a spiritual war, it's out of our control, and that presents us with a challenge that is very puzzling, because it is not clear in any moment what our duty is. It is not clear at any moment what we can do, what the solution is. We can't possibly come up with a solution.
right,
We cannot basically make a plan for how we fight this war. In a certain sense, we have to become, all we can do is to be available to the forces of good, the forces of God, that we will be there when we are called upon, and that whatever is necessary, we will do. And that's the kind of principle I apply, because I really don't know how to deal with this. I
sure,
really don't know how you could possibly even envisage reversing this assault. But yet I have a faith that it is possible. Because why? Because it isn't up to me.
right. As Chesterton said, we serve the God who knows the way out of the grave
Yes,
in the
that's right.
everlasting man.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, Matt. And that's in a strange kind of way. It's a very hopeful thought.
Yes,
It's very cheering thought, actually. That, oh, I don't need to solve this
yes, yes.
because I can't.
That's good. I mean, but that is good news. It takes a lot of pressure off of us
Yes.
to have to figure this out. So you mentioned the role of the church. Uh, some. So what was the role of the church in Ireland before the secularism began creeping and making its way through? I mean, what, because again, as Americans, we don't, all we hear from most modern history teachers is the church was just an oppressive place, and people had to only get their back alley abortions because it was illegal. All the
Well,
same
yeah.
claptrap that we hear. But there
Yeah.
was a
Well,
sense of beauty there, though, that
well
we miss.
the, yes. Um, it's a multifaceted question. Um, and you can talk about it in sociological terms, and you can also talk about it in personal terms. And if I talk about it in personal terms, what I can say is that my experience of the church was overwhelmingly benign in my childhood. Overwhelmingly, I mean, uh, it was a safe place to go. I mean, the church, the actual physical building, was the only place in town that I could walk in the door of any time of day, and spend time there on my own. It was open to me. And I remember that very strongly, that sense of being welcome there and being entitled to be there, being free there. And that gave me a certain sensibility about the world and about my place in it, and my sense of freedom as being in a strange way paradoxical, that it depended, my sense of freedom depended not on, it wasn't a question of just letting rip, it was a question of adhering to something, to belong to something. Now that journey was checkered in my life, and I've written a lot about it. I wrote a book called Lapsed Agnostic because I strayed off for a number of years and then came back. And in a certain sense, now I have to say I'm kind of straying off again, but that's a more complex question because it has to do with the last 4 years. And I really believe that the church in Ireland did not serve its people well in that period. But that's a different question. The question you're asking, though, I think you see all of that stuff about, of course there was, there were things that happened in the church and under the church's watch in the 50s, 60s, 70s that were, bad. But they were very much part of more than the church. They were part of the state. They were part of a kind of a combination. Like they were in the education system. They were dealing with social problems. They were, the church and state operating together. And of course, that's always a mistake. It's always a bad thing when that happens because the church becomes bureaucratic and loses its mission. And that certainly happened. There is a telling on all this that talks about infiltration of the church on a global basis, which I do not disbelieve. I think there's a lot in it. And you can see the traces of that also in the child abuse stories and so on. But what is left out of that picture all the time is the fact that while all this was happening, there was hundreds of thousands of priests and nuns doing extraordinary work in nursing, in education, in preaching the Gospels. And in really, I think, creating the personality of Ireland or nurturing the personality of Ireland in that way that I speak of it. Because there is an extraordinary gentleness, I think, in principle in the Irish personality, a sense of an empathy that is, it's only when you start to miss it in places now, as I do, where you encounter in a public place rudeness, where once you would have a conversation, you know what I mean? You would have an encounter, the beginning of a relationship even, because the person would become so interested in your problem and almost feeling a necessity to prove themselves by solving it and being disappointed more so than you if they fail to solve your problem. It's in small and kind of quite ludicrous ways you can see this, where if somebody comes to Ireland and stops an Irish person and asks for directions, the Irish person, if being unable to help them, is far more disappointed than the person who asks. And that's really true. It's really, really true. There's something about our desire. People, I mean, in psychobabble, it's called people pleasing, but it's much deeper than that. It's really a need to actually establish relationships, and that's dying now. But all of that has to do with Christianity. Not entirely. I shouldn't say that actually, because Christianity, and I recently did a talk about this in public. Christianity comes on top of a history of paganism and Christian Celtic Christianity. So there's a continuum there. So there's many facets in it. And Ireland's history, is really interesting because if you go back 3,000 years, we had a system of laws in Ireland called the Brehon laws, which are, as advanced as anything that exists now, in terms, far more so in the terms of their respect for freedom and autonomy and so on.
Right.
So many people don't know this. They in Ireland, they don't know this. They don't know about these things. And they think that, they believe the mythology, which is the mythology of colonization, which is, as Frantz Fanon described it, that before the advent of colonialism, there was nothing but savagery. Well, that certainly wasn't true of Ireland, if indeed it was true of anywhere. Uh, but so the church was, I think, a central part of that. But it seems to me that there's two things I would criticize the church for, and I've mentioned one of them, which is the very recent one. But before that, I think that the great mistake the church made way back was in oversimplifying and moralizing the Christian message.
Mm.
That morality was put uppermost. And it was taught as though as if that's all it was, and that we're now suffering the backlash against that. But of course, Christianity is not built like that at all.
Right.
Christianity does not start; it starts with Christ, with this
Right.
extraordinary person, its extraordinary personality, and extraordinary insights into human reality and existence. And only at the end of that relationship, when that relationship is made, only then do you, in a certain sense, come to the shorthand of morality.
Right.
Purely by way of remembering the headline points. And so it seems to me that, you see, one of the terrible things is, Matt, that we were not permitted a discussion about any of this while it was happening.
Right.
If you made any attempt to intervene in these discussions, and I did, and numerous, I got into terrible trouble, but by talking about the need of humanity for a transcendent idea, that idea of moving through reality, that we're going somewhere, we're going somewhere. But of course, immediately you are put down as simply trying to defend the indefensible, whatever that might be in the particular instance. And most people just shut up then. I mean, those of us who were foolish didn't for a long time. I mean, but I have to say, even within that context, I was appalled by the behavior of the church in closing its doors in the spring of 2020, in abandoning its people, and then afterwards the obsession with face masks and, hand washing on the altar. That there was no holy water in the font, but there was,
Really?
yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, it was really terrible. And I think, again, that goes back to the point I made, that what happens to very often in the church has happened in Ireland. I won't generalize, because I've met some great clerics. Met some great bishops and cardinals, and there are some wonderful people in those positions. But very often what you get rising to the top of an edifice like in Ireland, a country like Ireland, is the most bureaucratic-minded clerics, who become almost indistinguishable from the politicians that they deal with. And they see themselves as carrying out a certain role in society that is somehow a complementary one to that of the politician. And I think that has been very, very, very damaging for Christianity and the church in general, because, really people don't understand. Most Irish people now seem to think that Christianity is just simply a series of rules made by old men with, long dresses, and they don't want it, but they don't realize that that is actually destroying the hopes of their own children, because you have removed transcendent imagination from the culture, and that's fatal to any culture.
If there is no metaphysics, then morality or ethics don't matter.
Yes. Well, I was reading recently a book by American sociologist Philip Reeve.
Oh, yes.
And it's called, I have it here actually somewhere, but it's called, let me just see. It's not there now.
Is it My Life in the Death Works?
Yes. My life among the death works. That's exactly it. And really, when it's quite extraordinary. That book was published, I think, in 2006, which was the year he died, if I'm not mistaken, which is like just less than 20 years ago. And that book is highly prophetic
Yes.
of what's happened to Ireland now, because he talks about the three. We touched on already, Matt. The three, the mythological, the first world. What he calls the first world, the mythological world, which is the pagan world, the ancient Grecian world, the American Indian world. So where you have a belief in gods, a transcendent imagination that works at that level, that works on the basis of fate, Fate, and taboos. And then in the second world, you have the Abrahamic religions, as he describes it, in which you have ruled by commandments and faith and commandments, Faith. But then, and again, a transcendent idea, which is the driving force of all these. But then he says, when you let that go, there is a kind of inversion that happens. And in the third world, you get essentially a licentious, nihilistic, empty culture of pornography and lechery and all kinds of lewdness and so on. I can't remember exact words, but that's the general picture. And that's exactly what's happened to Ireland, where, overnight, like we spend, we've just talked. I mean, just think about it in this of what we've just spoken about in relation to the church's problems back in, say, the 90s in relation to clerical sex abuse. This society has worn itself out talking about this, the horror of it, the awfulness of it. Now, a few years later, the government is trying to impose pornography, gay pornography, on young children in schools over the heads of their parents.
Right.
It is pushing drag queens into libraries, drag queens which are basically ugly men dressed as prostitutes, female prostitutes, who have to read stories and wave their buttocks or whatever at little children. And nobody's standing up and saying, what? What's going on?
Right.
Apart from a handful of people who are regarded as, the far right.
Right.
In other words, that what was it all about? What exactly were we condemning for all those years when we attacked pederast priest or whatever we call them? What was that about? If now that we've finished that stage of the operation, we're going to now engage in the antithesis,
Right.
which is the celebration of handing our children over for grooming to these people. And that's the government doing this.
We have been, well, the American phrase is we have been played. We have been, lied to purposefully. And the scary thing about the death works, as I understand Reef to say, they're not just things that are contrary to the first two worlds, but they actually hollow out the best
Yes.
of those worlds. It's not like they're not creating a competing edifice to say Chartres Cathedral. It's not like they're building this ugly building next to Chartres saying this is in comparison. No, first they tear down and they destroy the beautiful.
Yes.
And then they build up something that is antithetical and even antichrist against it. That is against all that is good, that is true, that's holy, that's pure, and kind of like Aaron in after they came out of after they came out of Egypt. This is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Except, I mean, it's even worse than that. But yes, it's taking the best and it's destroying it. It's hollowing it out. It's taking the form of it, though. Kind of like when, let's see, when I believe it was Antiochus Epiphanes brought in and started slaughtering pigs in the Jewish temple. I mean, it's purposefully making a mockery of what is good.
Yes. Well, this is it's really, I call it a moral inversion, that this almost like overnight this occurred in Ireland. I, again around the time, certainly between 2011 and 2014, in that period between 2012 2013, it is like everything was turned upside down, and that good became bad, bad became good, wholesome became unwholesome. Like it was like that we had to reverse everything. It's like that syndrome you're talking about, the ugly building versus the old one being replaced by the ugly one, which is like, it's almost as if when you look, I often say to my wife, when we see, she asked me, why did somebody build that building next to that beautiful old one there? And I say, well, it's exactly, it's not an accident, it's not laziness, it's a reaction. It's like an antithesis, that because they have, of course, everything is now in binary form, particularly in the digital world. So we seem to have the capacity, and indeed this may be a human trait, we see things in terms of beauty and ugliness, and there is nothing in between, as far so, because the world is rejecting Christ, it is rejecting beauty, and therefore there is nothing left except ugliness. And that this is the explanation for everything, in the elevation of certain people who have acquired an ugliness by virtue of their actions and their words. But the strange thing is, they're now the virtuous ones, but in the culture, they can condemn the people who try to speak the truth. You know, this is, Matt, I struggle. This is where I begin to run out of a capacity to speak about this, because it defies anything that I was trained to use as a means of comprehension of reality. Because always we had, in growing up, there's a sense of, we all implicitly, we strive for excellence, we strive to make things better, we get up in the morning to work, to do good things. We don't get up to destroy the happiness of other people. But our politicians do, that's all they do now. They destroy the happiness of their own people deliberately, maliciously. They extol out downright, low lives, frankly, uh, as examples to the young. The young, because they have been indoctrinated with the idea of progress, and with the idea that we must move forward. I mean, all the time we must be moving forward, and moving forward has certain characteristics which are immutable. They're set in stone in history, from the beginning, whatever that beginning was. You wouldn't wonder. But now we what has happened, though, is that all the voices of wisdom have been stilled in our culture. They're no longer to be heard, because either they're afraid to speak, or they're cancelled. They're banished from the public sphere. So, like, in my debate, from all my working life, from about as a journalist, from the certainly from the late '80s through to 2013, I was a central figure in this debates in Ireland, and then I just disappeared, because it wasn't possible any longer. Because my only purpose for them was to burlesque me, and to abuse me, and to prove me wrong by ridicule, or by abuse, not by reason, because they couldn't. They don't want you to be able to speak. They don't want to give you space to speak. They do all kinds of tricks. So I just, in the end, voluntarily walked away from it, because I couldn't any longer bear it. Uh, and I don't believe it has any use in a culture like this. I don't believe you can combat such a culture from within. So I now I really don't know how do you describe it? What do you say when you actually take a particular politician? You could think of an American I think of an Irish one. I think of the Deputy Prime Minister, Micheál Martin. Say he was the Prime Minister of Taoiseach for 3 years there recently. And I say, well, as far as I knew, he was a decent enough individual. He was straight. He was idealistic. He had values. He had morals. Now he's presiding over complete immorality. He is destroying the country that he was born in, the country of his family, the country of his children, of his neighbors. It seems not to matter to him. And so you kind of have to ask, what is going on? You said that Ireland was the Isle of Saints and Scholars. Well, now it is the island of noncery and nonsense. And I'm sorry, that's the best I can do. That's the best I can do by way of description. And the trouble is, Matt, that will anger certain people, but they won't deny it because they're quite proud of it in a certain other sense. They don't like me saying it, but they think, because ultimately it is a vengeance by them, born of their neurosis, on a past that they never tried to understand.
Hmm. So as we bring this in kind of in closing, you mentioned a lot of people in your book, in addition to your dad, that that their work has influenced you. One of the places that I really appreciated, you said at one point that your dad, that Matthew Crawford, the professor at least he used to be at Virginia. I don't know if he still teaches there or not, but that Matt Crawford reminded you of your dad, except just with a philosophy degree.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's one, and he certainly speaks the truth, and it's not popular. Who are a few other people that while some people who are very public may not speak the truth, there are people that you've relied on in the past to guide you in wisdom, whether they're living or dead. Who are some of those others?
Well, I always admired, for a long time, I have admired Robert Bly. He died there a couple of years ago. He was an American poet, and he wrote a lot about men, about fatherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great influence on me and a great support to me when I became a father in difficult circumstances. Um, I think he was a very, very important figure. Um, in the contemporary landscape, even though I don't agree with everything he says, and even though I kind of think he's evasive about certain subjects, I would name Jordan Peterson,
Right.
because I think he is extraordinarily erudite and articulate about certain things, and really extraordinary communicator. And I think that young men in particular need what he gives, because it's very nourishing, kind of, much of it, not all of it necessarily. I don't, as I say, I don't necessarily. But then again, I shouldn't even say that, because I don't like people say to me, I don't agree with everything you say.
Right.
Yeah, like, who does?
That's a
Like,
given. Yes.
yeah, like, I mean, you could actually pick any random person in the street and go up to them and say, I don't agree with everything you think.
Right.
You know, and if you couldn't say that, there'd be a problem.
Right.
It's the old saying. What is it? If everybody's thinking the same, the chances are that nobody's thinking at all.
Right.
So, so those I mentioned in that respect. I like Victor Davis Hanson very much, I must say. Like, although again, it's a very strange thing, Matt. But I thought that intellectuals in America, for some reason, seem to be slower to get the COVID thing than the Europeans. I'm not sure why that is. Uh, uh, like Victor, I think he gets it now, but in the beginning he was somewhat hesitant,
Right.
and didn't really catch up for quite some months. I don't know why that is, but it was true of others as well. Uh, Dr. Steve Hurley, Steve Turley, very much. He does very short, very apposite
Yes.
commentaries, but are sometimes quite profound. Sometimes he goes to the depths of things. So I'm not sure. You put me on the spot there, but
Sure. That's a good start.
yeah, certainly Matthew Crawford. I really admire. His sense of the connection between the physical world and the mental world, as expressed in working with the hands. Because I think that was really the thing about my father, that his capacity, it's really, I often say to people, like, if you look at a little child of 6 months old crawling on the carpet, picking things up, feeling them, dropping them, throwing them, tasting them, sniffing them, um, that's the way the child understands the whole world.
Right.
That's the beginning of a process of understanding the whole world. And we continue that. The problem is in the modern world that at some point that's interrupted by second hand learning, which is necessary in itself. But if you stop engaging physically with the world, then something happens to you, that to your senses, and the connection between your senses and your mind, which is very profound. And I think that that's something that Matthew Crawford understands so completely and
Yes.
beautifully. And his books, are so wonderful in that respect. His Shop Class Soulcraft is a really wonderful book. And The World Outside My Head is a more complex and deeper book, but more, I suppose, challenging book, I guess,
Right.
because it's more philosophical and so on, but very rewarding. I think he's wonderful, and uh, that's kind of the ones that jump out at me right now.
Sure.
I also like novelists. I mean, there's a great. I think the best novelist operation in the world now is, strangely, he's not a wonderful writer, but he's an extraordinary imagination. It's Michel Houellebecq. He's a French
Mm.
guy, Frenchman, and he writes about the collapse of the human culture in a very terrifying and very real way.
Yes. He does not make it pleasant for
No,
those who are squeamish or on the fundamentalist side of things.
that's right. That's right. He is something of a nihilist, I think. But again, I enter the caveat that with those guys, I often think, again, they think the same about Nietzsche as with Samuel Beckett and with Houellebecq, that there's a kind of a plea at the heart of what they're saying is, please prove me wrong.
Right. Right.
I want to be wrong. I want to be wrong. I don't want to be right. Nietzsche never wanted God to be dead. Really, I don't
Right.
believe.
That does come out more in some of his writings than others.
Yes,
And I would
yes,
actually say, in reading you, the person that I've thought of, in because I've read your Substack for a while, and and this book, and I've read you on First Things. There's a lot in your work and your perspective that reminds me of Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, very
yeah.
much. That there is it is a plea for people to disengage from all of the nonsense that society is offering up, the shallow, vapid, empty mush, and to actually embrace the faith and all of its wonder.
Yes, I think that's right. But again, the language is so tricky, because I'm aware when you try to describe these things, it's almost like it's all landmined. That there are certain words. The word faith is landmined. Because people don't generally do not approach these questions with an open mind. So you have to find you have to kind of do a little bit of limbo dancing if you want to stay in the discussion with the general population at the moment. I don't say
Hmm.
that's a definitive or final situation, terminal situation. I think that will change. I really believe that. See, the fundamental problem is that in the world, about in that context, is that we believe that we have evolved past the point where God is credible. But in reality, what's happened is that we have constructed a false culture within which it has become possible to believe that. But that culture, as Pope Benedict said, is the bunker, the culture of the bunker. It has closed out virtually everything. It has closed out the mystery of existence. And that's the trick that mankind has played. When you take down those walls of that bunker and look at the open space around you and look to the horizon in every direction, you realize you don't know anything. And that therefore you have to begin again formulating words. And that brings you back to the idea that, you know, the strangest thing in that situation as you stand here, the strangest thing imaginable is that you are standing here.
Right.
And when you think about it like that, anything else is possible. The idea that nothing else is possible is such an absurdity. In other words, the kind of nihilistic kind of, atheistic, this is all there is, extinction, extinction, extinction. It's so absurd when you think of your own existence in this moment. How did this happen? How does it happen? What am I? How can I possibly not believe in something greater if I believe I am here now? This is, I think, the core of because what's actually happening when you actually hear people decrying religion or dismissing religion, what they're dismissing is a caricature of religion. They're
Right.
dismissing something which they never really got to understand or even attempted to understand. They see that kind of moralistic, forbidding God, and they just don't want any part of it. It's a big, big mistake because ultimately the sole sufferer is the person themselves, because they lose that capacity to walk lightly through reality with the head held high, moving towards the horizon, full of hope, full of expectation, and noticing that the horizon moves ahead all the time, but nevertheless progressing, we're moving forward. I think this to me is what faith is. This is what religion is. This is what spirituality is. But it's a terrible thing. But at this precise moment, I feel that we almost have to put it in that kind of language exclusively for people to actually, to somehow penetrate to people that maybe they're just seeing it in the wrong way. And then, of course, when you get them to understand, then they can go back
Right.
into everything
Right.
and open with an open heart and an open mind. And I think that's possible, because I do not believe that it's simply a factor of chronological time that atheism seems to be a rational position. I don't believe that that's something that we should accept. But at the moment, that's what you would think, listening, certainly in Ireland, listening to most young people talking, if you did listen to the radio and TV, that's what you would gather. If you talk to artists now who are supposed to be the fonts of spirituality, they don't
Right.
believe in anything, it seems. This needs to be addressed in a conversation, not by me proselytizing or preaching, but simply by, let's compare notes, let's compare words and see
Sure.
where we go.
Well, John, this has been really good. I appreciate you taking time to talk. There's so many things that we could have talked about in addition to this, because I know you are a
Sure.
student of rock and roll music, and you have some very interesting ideas on that I've learned a lot just by listening to some of what you've said and written about that, in addition to other things. So this is really good. Again, your book is "Give Us Back the Bad Roads," and you have several other books that you mentioned already. And the Lapsed Agnostic book is one that I've appreciated, and then also Beyond Consolation: How We Became Too Clever for God. Those are two really good. So thank you for taking time to join us today.
The Good Life podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, Got a Minute, featuring Larson Hicks and Rich Luss. Theology, philosophy, economics, politics, and more for normal people.